Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome back, everybody, to the afternoon session of the Government Contracting Cybersecurity Summit, presented by Federal Publication Seminars and in partnership with Neo Systems. We also want to thank all of our other sponsors, Protiviti, BDO, and RJO as well, for being a part of this program. Hope everybody had a great 1 hour. If you're at lunchtime on the East Coast, hope you had a good lunch, and then welcome back. We have a really good session coming up. But first, let's recap a little bit, Elizabeth, of what we heard today. So, you have any thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I thought that all the sessions went really well. I'm sorry, again. And I mean, there are a lot of good takeaways from the CMMC in particular, a lot of different viewpoints. And Ed, I'll let you weigh in as well while I go off camera.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so we had Laura Chris, Bloomberg Government this morning, started out with a little future of government spending in cybersecurity, gave us a little background of what Bloomberg is seeing and opportunities as well. So I thought that was very interesting, both from a DoD perspective and other agencies. Session 2, we had a great conversation with Katie Arrington, Ed Bassett, moderated with Eric Crucis from Holland and Knight, Michael Baker, Neil Biggin, and Jeff Trinidad from both the industry and from Risk and Assurance, Cherry Beckert, Neil Baggins from. So that was a very fascinating discussion on where we're at with CMMC and operationalizing the audit readiness. So good information. I know a lot of you had questions. We probably didn't get to all those questions answered, so we're going to do our best afterwards to disseminate those questions to the panelists, and if they have a chance to answer you back for those that didn't get answered. And we went on to session 3. Just before lunch, we had Perry Keating, Ed Bassett again with Neo Systems, Perry Keating with Protiviti was moderating, with Timothy Trickett and Christina Reynolds, both from BDO, talking about the Dfars, the interim rule and implementation of those. So I thought all 3 sessions were excellent, and want to know what you guys thought of those first 3 sessions. So I'm going to open up a polling question before we get started on this. Which session was most valuable to you from this morning's session? And we'll give another 15, 20 seconds for you all to vote. This will help us in the future because I think, as Elizabeth and I talked at lunchtime, we're planning on doing another one in 2021, hopefully in person, maybe even do a hybrid where it's in person and also virtual. So we'll see how it all plays out. All right, I'm going to close the poll. Share the results. No surprise, I think they liked Ed's, Katie's, Eric's, and companies one on the CMMC DIV. Thank you for your input. So at this time, I want to introduce again back to Ed Bassett, who is going to be with Timothy Trickett and Christina Reynolds in a little fireside chat.
Thanks, Todd. Tim and Christina, thanks for joining. This is a quick warm-up after lunch. Before lunch, as Todd was just reviewing, we heard quite a bit about the new Dfar's interim rule and some of the reporting requirements. So maybe we'll just spend a few minutes diving into that. Looking at those requirements from the practical sense, what exactly is it companies need to do to comply? We've heard of a November 30th deadline. So what is the thing that happens on that date, on November 30th? I'll start with you, Christina.
Okay, sure. So November 30th, while it is a hard-coded date, a lot of it after that time is going to end up when you get a contract action that needs to happen. So while they do want you to get that score in by November 30th, you may not have a new contract that would be awarded till sometime after that, but they are at the point of that contract action happening, whether it's a new contract being issued or awarded to you, or a contract modification or something along those lines, they will check to see if you've got a score in there prior to that award or mod being issued. So November 30th is that hard date, but remember, there may be some time, right, before you actually see somebody saying we need to see that score in there.
I mean, my understanding is that there's no requirement to report your score prior to November 30th. Just that on November 30th, they're going to start putting it in contracts, and you'll need to do it prior to award of one of those contracts. Is that accurate?
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
That's accurate. And furthermore, like I said, for some contractors, they may not have a score in there on November 30th, and they may not see contract actions happening for some time afterwards. They may see an award happening on one of their contracts, and they may turn around and see their contract officer pushing to get that score in there. So, be patient with the process. I would say go ahead and set yourself up in SPRS, anticipating that.
Got it. So next question, I'll direct towards Tim is looking at what if the score is not very good? So what if your score is not good? There's not been a minimum set by the government as far as we're aware, but we get a lot of questions from people who have really not worried about the NIST 171, maybe because they didn't believe it applied to them. They didn't store or process any covered defense information. And this new reporting requirement has them worried, and they're worried maybe they misinterpreted the Dfar's requirement. They're worried maybe they do have some CUI, even though they've been operating thinking they don't. Their large primes are asking them, sending out questionnaires. We heard about some of that in the sessions this morning. So the large primes are saying, hey, we want you to tell us what your status is. And they're worried that those primes who are their customers are going to not view them favorably if they say, oh, my score is bad, or I don't have one because I don't have any CUI. Tim, what's your advice for those companies that might not be in good shape to report a favorable, good-looking score at this time?
So the first thing you have to do is you need a starting point, and really the only way to do that is to conduct a self-assessment against 800-171 requirements. If you don't have, and in a lot of cases, most of these organizations don't have their own IT department. They don't have a cybersecurity person. It's outsourced to a managed service provider or another third-party service provider. So they need to really start asking, those third-party service providers, hey, how are you guys looking in terms of, CMMC and Dfar's compliance? When the time comes for me to do this, are you going to be, there? Or do I need to find another service provider that can help me? And then for the ones that, do have the IT department and do have those in-house resources, conduct the self-assessment, fill out a POAM, sit down with your, the person in your company that writes the checks, whether it's the CEO or your CFO or someone else, and, start, going through that POAM and figuring out what resources are needed to, become compliant and start knocking some of those items off of your POAM. The worst thing that you can do is nothing. So, even just going through and doing a self-assessment, or a lot of times we'll see organizations hire third-party consultants to come in and do an assessment. There's no requirement for that, but it is a great, have someone else, have another set of eyes come in and look. Or I even see a lot of cases where you'll find two small businesses that both have to do the same thing. Well, okay, look at each other's. It doesn't cost any money to partner up with another small business in a similar space. I can come in and check out Neo Systems. You guys can come look at mine, and we just saved ourselves having to pay a third-party consultant. There's plenty of different resources out there that are free that organizations can get access to now to help them with figuring out what they need to do to be CMMC and 800-171 ready.
And I'd like to add on to some of that, Ed, because I think, Tim always has the best ideas. So I just wanted to add some flourish onto that. Two, I think, as he was saying, leverage from each other. And I know there's a heavy bit of competition, having come from a small business world myself. I do understand that small businesses don't always want to give their their secrets up to another competitive small business. However, reach out to your prime as well. So a lot of these small businesses might be going through ExoStar cybersecurity questionnaires with their prime on the other end. And these primes are a great and fantastic source of how do the big guys do it. And they are very eager during those assessments to share how they have done it from their infrastructure, what products they have used. You'll find that the primes definitely are aware of how valuable their subcontractors are, and how much they rely on them as much as the subcontractors rely on the primes. And the primes are eager to make you become fully compliant with those regulations. In addition, another thing I want to add to, again, just adding on to things that Tim has said, when we talk about a POAM, I just want to kind of back up and say that POAM is your plan of action and milestones. And a POAM is really designated to be the things you haven't done. And what is that timeline and that ultimate milestone date that you're going to be achieving all of those items within your POAM. Well, let's back up another half step and say the SPRS database that they've created for this is your living POAM as well. So it's good, while it's good to document your POAM internally, that SPRS is now your living POAM that is contract officer facing. So while your primes may not see it, your contract officer is. So treat also that SPRS database as your living POAM. And while you may start out with a pretty bad score, and I hate to say that some of my customers who thought they were standing good as long as they were scoring their assessment security controls as a 0 or a 1, 0 being not implemented and 1 being implemented, they look pretty good. When we implemented the SPRS scoring and it was a -5 for some of the highly, the secure controls that, if not implemented, presented the most highest vulnerability, they were in a negative range, as Katie indicated earlier. So don't be afraid of that. As Tim said, excellent to treat that as your POAM and move forward.
And going back to the comments about reporting to the primes and working with your primes, I think that's great advice, because the primes are eager to help. And one of the things we've seen primes do a lot of is asking for score reporting to them. Now, there is no legal or regulatory requirement that people report their scores to their primes. The requirement is to report it to the DoD and the SPRS system that we heard Katie mention this morning. And your prime can't see it in there. The DoD can see it. You can see your own score. What the prime has to do is verify that you have, in fact, reported that. What they're doing in most cases, as a matter of practice, is they're saying, prove it to me, send me a copy of your score and your date, because that's going to help them evaluate who needs help, who doesn't, who's good to do business with, who's taking this seriously and who's not. So in theory, again, I don't think anybody's required to report to their prime, but these are your customers and they're asking. So I think you certainly want to take advantage of that, and maybe there's something that flows back the other way in terms of support.
Right.
So last question, we've got 2 minutes left. So it's easy to get wrapped up in the questions about applicability. What does this mean to me? And the sort of technical details of the Dfar's rule. It's all new. We're trying to analyze it, but it's led in some cases to sort of analysis paralysis, right? Maybe that's an excuse to delay taking steps. Maybe people who are trying to think this might go away or think they can somehow get out of it. For those who are sitting on the sidelines and waiting for further clarity, or maybe they're waiting even for some kind of a exception or pass, what's your suggestion on how they can snap out of that analysis paralysis? So our adversaries out there, they're not waiting for the CMMC accreditation body to update their website. They're not waiting for some Wikipedia article that answers every single question about CUI, right? So our adversaries are working diligently to steal our intellectual property. So waiting is not the right thing. If you're a company that wants to do the right thing, what are the things you could do confidently, even though maybe some of the details are fuzzy in the future?
I would definitely start with baby steps, right? So we know that the Dfar 7012 is pretty hard coded into most of our contracts, but a good baby step is protecting your FCI first. So starting with that CMMC maturity level 1, because those are what they see as the basic cyber hygiene steps that you need to be taking. And you can start with those 17 controls and really start to hone your approach. What's really good about that is those 17 controls cross map into controls in the NIST 800-171 framework, which cross maps into the overall CMMC level 3 progression. So you're not wasting effort if you're starting at that CMMC level 1 basic cyber hygiene. In addition, pay attention to some of the questionnaires I've seen coming around from the primes are asking very specific questions about your progression within that context of what we're entering in for the SPRS under Dfar 12 and CMMC level 3. They're saying, how far have you gotten? And some of these very specific questions are saying, have you performed the basic controls? And those are identified very clearly. There's about 30 of them. And they want you to get through those 30 basic controls as well. And so that is a great place to start, is start with your, your CMMC level 1 controls, progress on to your 30 basic controls, and then kind of migrate upwards from there. Those baby steps will help you implement the overall schema of controls.
Cool. Tim, any closing remarks you want to add on?
Really, I mean, the worst thing that anyone can do right now is nothing. I mean, even just using complex passwords is better than nothing. Multi-factor authentication, limiting administrator access to the internet, just, little things that you can do. I mean, if you do nothing else, just try to, keep the adversaries out. I mean, that's the least you could do. And then again, yeah, the FAR 52 basic safeguarding requirements is really the first place to start if you're just starting to crack open this whole thing.
Very good. Tim, Christina, thanks very much. Back over to you, Todd.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you all three, Tim and Christina and Ed. We're now going to shift right away over to Jeffrey Shiao. Jeffrey's with Rogers, Joseph, and O'Donnell, RJO. RJO has been in the forefront of a lot of the cybersecurity things going on. One of Jeff's partners, and you probably recognize his name, does a lot of writing on this. And so Jeff has been also big in the area. He teaches for federal publication seminars on the cybersecurity framework. And we asked him to spend an hour, 40 minutes, whatever time it is, 45 minutes with us to talk through changes in the framework and what's going on and from a legal perspective in government and cybersecurity and federal government contracting. So welcome, Jeff. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Tom.
Let me give you control of the program. I'm going to make you presenter, so everybody's going to be seeing your screen. You've done this before, so you kind of hopefully remember how to do all that.
Thanks also for sponsoring, Jeff.
Yep, thank you. How about 1 second while I pull up my slides, and let me ask one quick question.
Yes.
Was anybody else going to join me for a little back and forth, or is this really me for the 45?
Well, I invited Tim and Christina. I wasn't sure if they were already prepared to back and forth, but if they want to jump in, they may jump in once in a while.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, can folks see the presentation there?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, I'm Jeff Shiao. I'm with Rogers, Joseph, O'Donnell. I thank the folks at Neo Systems for always inviting us to help out, and the folks at FedPubs. This is a really important area, and you guys have spent a lot of time talking about it already today. So when I was thinking about how to approach this and was invited, I thought the one thing I don't want to do is to try to go through all of the requirements and explain to you what you should be doing to meet CMMC level 1 or 2 or 3, or kind of the differentiation among and between those things. for two reasons. One, you've already heard a lot of that and from people who are probably more expert, certainly more expert than me, in helping you to really put in place those controls. But I thought what I might be able to do is offer you some perspective of how these rules fit in how they kind of represent the maturation of our cybersecurity framework for especially that which applies to government contractors. It was back in 2008 when I recommended to somebody that our law firm, as a different law firm, start a cybersecurity practice, and I was actually laughed at. This is not something that's going to be sort of a flash in the pan. It's not that important. That was 2008. And nowadays, a lot of firms, and especially a lot of government contracts practices, firms with government contracts practices, really have to be adept at and conversant in these concepts of cybersecurity. But one of the things I think is interesting is how little of what we have been doing and what we are doing now is based in law. It is so much based in executive orders and executive action. That's important, and it's kind of relevant to the moment we're in as people think about, well, how are these rules going to change? Is this really going to be here in 2 months? Especially if you're somebody who has just kind of heard about this and are wondering, how do I catch up? Or if you've sort of been ignoring it as one of the 10 things on your inbox and one that never kind of rose to the top, you're hearing a lot of people, including Tim just now, saying the worst thing you can do is nothing. I think that's absolutely right. But it begs this question, this legal question, well, with the change in administration and because it's not based in law, it's based in executive action, is this thing going to be around? And I think the answer is yes. And I think going through these slides, I can help you understand why I think that's the case. And I do invite anybody who wants to ask questions to please interrupt me. I didn't build slides to go for 45 minutes. I built slides to have a 40-minute conversation here. So next slide. Okay. All right. People can see me, but I can't see myself. That's good. This webinar is giving me useful information because I'm trying to read my slides here. So this one is a slide that I present twice a year or so. Myself and a couple of other attorneys from RJO present this class through FedPubs that's called the Framework of Cybersecurity Regulation and Law. And I break out this slide and I kind of go through it in great detail, and Lauren Sujith, who co-presents with me, gets really frustrated. But I think it's useful to just hit on the things at least that are highlighted here, but to point out for context what else is here, because they go back to that question of, is this going to be here in 2 months or 3 months? So all the way back to 1974, we start seeing the government take an interest in information and privacy of information. But that really changes over time. With 1996, we get the Clinger-Cohen Act, and we start using much more commercial practices in government procurement. And we see a real explosion in the use of information systems, computers, and networked information systems. And then sort of back in 99, we see the first efforts of Congress to figure out how do we make rules for what we do here. And then September 11th happened, and that necessitated a relook at information, including, importantly and sort of relevant to the discussion today, controlled unclassified information. And that controlled unclassified information sort of gets dealt with as a concept in FISMA of 2002, but not really. FISMA was just a law that got passed as part of the E-Government Act that said, okay, now we got all these computers around. The government should probably start protecting the information that they have in it. And you'll see that FISMA of 2002 gets updated in 2014 with the Federal Information Systems Modernization Act. That was important, relevant, and it made sort of the decade or the dozen years of change between the passage of FISMA in 2002 to the Modernization Act saw a lot of things happen, and that kind of spurred Congress to get into motion again. But that's it as far as Congress sort of legislating federal information systems. There's a couple of other things here. The Computer Information Sharing Act of 2015, that is Congress passing a law. And then you see Congress passing other sort of supply chain laws, Section 806 of the 2010 NDAA, Section 818 of the 2012 NDAA. But really, information systems and the protection of controlled unclassified information begins, it's the next entry after FISMA there, Executive Order 13556. That's an Obama administration executive order that said, we got to get our arms around this controlled unclassified information. You know, our eyes were open to a problem on September 11th, and that we had all these stovepiped pieces of information, and agencies who didn't have classified information still couldn't even talk to each other because there were all these restrictions on how you share information. So that begat this initiative in 2010 to get our arms around it, to have a kind of a coherent strategy. That gets kind of bolstered in 2013 with the another executive order on critical infrastructure, which says, among other things, that we should build into the acquisition process some sort of a rationale for procuring with information security, cybersecurity in mind. So those two executive orders, and then a lot of things that followed them, including it's like the last three bullets that you'll see here. The Dfar's interim rule that was first passed back in 2015, where DoD said, oh my gosh, we got all this controlled unclassified information, and it's now 2016 at the time 2017 when that came out, and they're saying, we've had NIST over there trying to write this rule and tell us how to deal with controlled unclassified information for a long time. Let's get it done. And so DoD got out in front, as it has stayed out in front on this topic, and wrote a rule. And they did it in coordination with the CUI rule that was being written by NIST, that was being written by NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, the people who protect our federal information. And then a publication was written, NIST Special Publication 800-171. And probably another entity that was swirling around there was OMB. There was a lot of this activity that happens 2015, 2016, 2017 to try to create this. And it created the Special Publication 800-171, which became the guidebook that people were supposed to use. And in fact, per that Dfar's rule, it was as it was amended, not this Dfar's rule that we're talking about today, but the prior one for safeguarding CUI. It said that as a contractor, you shall be 800-171 compliant by December of 2017, period. In fact, you're certifying to it when you accept a government contract. But as you probably heard Katie Arrington talk about this morning, that wasn't enough. Just telling people, hey, you got to meet these controls if you got CUI, it wasn't spurring people into action. And I got a slide about that a little bit later. But that brings us to this Dfar's interim rule, which in many ways I think is kind of a last-ditch effort for DoD to say, we've been pulling you along, we've been pulling you along, we've been pulling you along. Now we can't any longer sort of accept your representation about how secure your systems are. We need you to show us. And that's why we get this Dfar's rule. This slide, though, just goes to the key point from the last slide, which is that FISMA, the Federal Information Systems Management Act, now Modernization Act, is the guiding light, or the only sort of statutory guiding light for all of these requirements. And it really is focused on the government. The only part of FISMA that's focused on contractors that says that agencies must provide information security protections, blah, 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 for information systems used or operated by an agency or by a contractor of an agency or other organization on behalf of an agency. And so let's jump to the next slide and talk about what that really means. It's a really helpful slide that was created by the folks at DoD. This has appeared in the frequently asked questions for a long time, and it's the best device I know of to talk about what FISMA is supposed to do and what these other rules are doing. That big black line down the center there says that everything on the left is the contractor's internal system. And that's what the new Dfar's interim rule that you're hearing about today is focused on. And it's really what most of the efforts that I pointed out on that last slide are focused on, is all that stuff on the left-hand side of the ledger. On the right-hand side of the ledger is that which can be controlled per statute, and the statute is FISMA. And it's broken into two pieces. The top piece, that's a little bit darker blue, is for systems operated on behalf of the DoD. And that on behalf of the agency, or here the DoD, that comes right from the language of FISMA, and it says per statute, this is what you got to do here. And then the one on the bottom is DoD owned and or operated information systems. If it's DoD systems, they're also covered by FISMA. But really on the left-hand side, everything that's being done over there is guided not by a statute, but it's all guided by that 2010 Obama executive order, the 2013 executive order, and then the rules and regulations that have followed it. Let me just say one other thing before we jump off of this slide. This slide is useful because it shows you kind of the, what's the closest to the center is what you want to protect. So at the outside, you have federal contract information. Then as you come in a little bit closer, you got controlled unclassified information around the government. And then as you get in closer to the middle, you got covered defense information, which is a term that's defined in the 7012 clause, again, that's been around for a long time, in place in its current form since late 2017. That covered defense information, that's the real intellectual property and those sorts of things that DoD is really worried about protecting. This slide then just talks to how did we get here. We started with the 800-171 being a set of rules, and that set of rules is just those 110 controls that you've heard folks talking about today. And those are expected of companies who host, use, or transmit CUI. We also had NARA, who in that 2010 Obama executive order was told, hey, NARA, you're the folks who control the NISPOM that deals with classified information. I need you to also write a CUI rule. So they're the people who wrote that rule. By the way, they were told to do that in the 2010 executive order. And as you see on the slide here, they actually got it done in August of 2016. So that was a really long effort to get that accomplished. And then you'll notice in that other little blue kind of bubble box there, the FAR CUI protection rule. We actually don't have a FAR rule yet that's like the Dfar's CUI rule. We are so close, we hear, but we don't have that yet. So you start with that, with the technical publication, that 171. You add to it sort of the rule making around it that's produced by the NARA CUI rule, and then you have to throw on top of that acquisition measures, and that's the Dfar 7012 clause that we've heard about for a long time. It's been in your contracts, in every DoD contract for a long time. And it says that DoD suppliers, except for those providing just commercial off the shelf, have to provide adequate security using the 800-171 safeguards to protect covered defense information. And it also says that you got to furnish incident reports to DoD for damage analysis. That's the rules that we've been living with. Again, it depends on how you count it, but really back to 2015, certainly from 2017, end of 2017. These are the rules. And so for more than 2 years, this is how you should have been conducting yourself if you are a defense contractor, and you will have covered defense information, which is defined again as any kind of CUI from any source. Now, one of the really difficult things about the 7012 clause is, how do I know if I have CUI? Well, because of pressure on DoD, they clarified that to mean you have covered defense information, you have CUI that's covered by this rule, and therefore a covered system that has to do all the things we're asking you to do, be 800-171 compliant. You are in that boat if We tell you you're in that boat. It's a critical point. It's a critical point that people don't lean on enough. I mean, there is enough confusion in this world, and certainly in these times, that you don't need to be guessing what your customer needs. You should ask them, and they should tell you. That's a perfect world, and we don't live in that world. But that's exactly what the rule says DoD must do. And then finally, this evolution gets us to where we are now. The Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification that you've heard about, and you heard Katie Arrington talk about today, and this curveball that was sort of thrown out in the Dfar's interim rule that was just published in September 28th. And what that curveball said was, you know what? We're on a pathway, we're on a glide path to CMMC, but self-attestation now is not enough. We got to get an actual assessment in there. We have to have a verification component. And that's what's spelled out in the rules, and I assume you've been hearing about all day. Because you've been hearing about it all day, I only have 2 basic slides on the operation of the rule. What it did was create 2 prongs. The first prong, and I would say, I call it the first prong mostly because it's first in time, is this Dod assessment methodology, which involves a low assessment, your self-assessment, and then potentially a medium and a high assessment when DoD asks for it. And again, the details of that, I assume you've heard about already. And then the second prong is the CMMC framework in order to assess contractor implementation for protection of DoD, for protection of unclassified information. That's what Katie Arrington and her folks have been focused on since early 2019, really laser focused on since early 2019. And this date is out there, and I'm not sure what things people have said about that date today, but when I was on a call with a client earlier today, I made clear to them, I said, look, you're going to have to submit this because you do perform DoD contracts, and those contracts will be extended through the exercise of options. So it's going to happen, but it is not going to happen on December 1st unless you're intending to submit a proposal on a solicitation that comes out November 30th and you submit on December 1st. So there is some time. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing anything, but it also doesn't mean you should throw your hands up and say, well, this is impossible. How can they possibly expect me to get this done? You don't have to get it done by November 30th. You have to begin your process so you can do it whenever you get awarded that first DoD contract that follows November 30th, or that first option exercise that follows November 30th. That DoD assessment is done using the DCMA methodology, which is available at that link that just takes you to a web page, and it's got the relevant stuff there. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of it. And then this is also a nice slide because it gives you a pointer to the SPRS where you can go look at that stuff. One of the things that's a little bit frustrating from a government contractor's perspective of implementation is that these clauses, 7019 and 7020, are going to show up in all your contracts, just like the 7012 clause. And that creates a bunch of confusion because people don't actually read what the 7012 clause says. It says something that matters to the 7012 clause, the 7019 clause, the 7020 clause, and the 7021 clause if it ever makes its way into your contract. What it says is you don't have to do this stuff unless you have covered defense information, unless you're going to have CUI. You're either going to store, transmit, or perhaps create controlled unclassified information in the performance of this contract. If you're not going to do those things, you're never going to have to submit your scorecard. Now, if you're a subcontractor, your prime might ask you to submit a scorecard. But just like the government, if they're asking you to do something that you're not required to do under the rules, and it's going to cost you $1 gazillion and maybe put you out of business, it's important to push back and to say, look, I need to know, are you going to give me covered defense information or not? If you're not going to give me covered defense information, then I'm not going to have it in my systems, and I am therefore not covered by the rule. I just read it, or at least that's what Jeff Shio told me in this class I was in the other day. CMMC was an attempt to solve many problems. problems. And this kind of goes through a few of those, but it's really, self-certification under 7012 wasn't working. They needed an objective, trustworthy seal of approval. They wanted to mitigate financial impact, though, especially for small businesses, so kind of have something uniform and not overly demanding. And really, one of the things about that is is helpful is that CMMC has 5 different levels, and many contractors are just going to be fine at level 1, CMMC level 1. It was an attempt to bring in cyber expertise that was offered by labs and nonprofits, so they are kind of the an important component of the CMMC, relying on the private sector to scale and conduct audits of 300,000 plus contractors. This is really the key problem that DoD has faced. It said, hey, I need you to meet this 800-171. NIST has written a nice document for us. We'd like everybody to be in compliance with it, but we don't have any auditors to send out, and we don't want to create a cottage industry for people to come over and give you certificates. So how do we do this? How do we meet that need for verification when we don't have the means or really the desire to set up this this mechanism or this kind of cadre of evaluators, auditors? And that's why CMMC kind of fixes that. Hey, let's push that off to the private sector, but let's do it in a way that's responsible, and importantly, is not going to put contractors in an unleveraged interaction with these third-party entities. So it means let's have uniform standards. Let's have people who don't have conflicted interests. So if you're a third-party assessment organization, you're not also selling services. All of that kind of went into this thinking about how do you make a useful, credible CMMC to deal with this stuff. Let's deal with the privity problem down the supply chain. I as the government can only force my contractor to do things. I can't force my contractor subcontractor to do things. But if I tell the subcontractor you can't play here unless you go through and get your CMMC accreditation, now I do have a little bit of reach beyond just that entity with whom I have privity of contract. It was an attempt to leverage the progress that was already in place. And again, I think Katie Harrington probably would say she wants this to be the model, not just for DoD, but maybe all of the government, maybe all the Five Eyes countries, maybe even NATO would get on board with this kind of rational approach. I threw this slide in here just to say, back to this question of what are we going to see in the future. Again, if you're building on an Obama executive order that was put in place by a NARA rule that was written under President Obama, and the NIST special publication that was largely written under President Obama, and then was carried on under the Trump administration, the idea that this is somehow going to go in a different direction than it has for the last 10 years, I think is unlikely. But I think it will get some tweaks. And the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was stood up by Congress kind of for the purpose of looking at these things more broadly. They, excuse me, they have some ideas on this stuff which they've shared in their report, and which they have shared with DHS and other entities that are going to have probably a greater influence under the next administration. So, I think that under the current administration, DOD's kind of propensity to say, I don't have time to wait, I want to get out in front of this, I think that fits well and was fully consistent with the current administration's view of like the national security import of protecting federal information systems. I do think that under the next administration, there may be an attempt to leverage this good work and make it broader across all of government, and probably not in ways that are significantly different than the current rules that we are living with. So that's my talk through the slides. It lasted a little bit longer than I thought it was going to, which is probably good and bad, but maybe we can take some questions either from other folks on the line or from the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did send a couple of questions over to you. I think you might have answered them though through your program. So let's see. Can you see that, Jeff?
So I can expand the box a little bit. It's looking tiny.
Yep.
And let's see. Questions. Come on, baby. I'm not doing. Let's see. I'm not doing real well with driving while I talk. So
all right. So
let me stop.
Ken asked the question: SPR scores is not required unless a contractor has a CUI, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's an important strategy for you to look at. I mean, so I have a client, long-term client, and they make really Gucci software, AI sort of relationship software that's really a great tool. But it's just algorithms, right? And so their business model, even though they're always getting information, they're getting information from special operations people, they're getting information from law enforcement officers, they're getting information from nuclear scientists, they're getting all kinds of controlled and classified information input into their tool. However, they provide a commercial piece of software which they give to their customers, and then their customers throw all that data in there. Client never has to worry about it. They never have to worry about how do I handle controlled and classified information, because they never get it. They say, here's my software. If you have any questions, give me a call. In fact, I'll embed an employee there as sort of like a rep to help you run the software. But don't send your stuff to me, because then I have a CUI problem. And that works great.
Okay. Sean asked a question. So does CDI always have to be identified by the government? It seems there is conflicting information about this. What about contractor developed information such as export controlled information?
Right. So I wish I had it in front of me, and I apologize that I don't. But the language of the 7012 in defining what is covered defense information, it says that it is controlled and classified information government-wide. But it does say in the definition of what is covered defense information that the government has to designate it as such. Now, of course, they can designate controlled and classified information in different ways. If they're going to send you information, they can label the wrapper or the information itself with an indication that it is covered defense information. But like in your scenario, where what they're trying to do is to make sure that you're controlling any export controlled information you create, they can describe that. They can describe that in the statement of work and say, that you shall properly mark covered defense information to include X, Y, and Z. And so there should never be a question in your mind, am I or am I not in a contract that is a covered contract, because it will involve me having access to, even on a temporary basis, any access to covered defense information in my information systems. And whenever you can set up the scenario to say no, now you've pushed off that obligation, at least for that contract. And again, people have whole business models that say, I'm not going to accept your covered defense information. I can work in your offices, work in your information systems. I can work in my primes information systems, whatever. That is a legitimate way to avoid some of these requirements.
Okay. Regarding ITAR data, should that automatically be considered CUI? Yeah,
if you go to the NARA has a website, and I think it's like NARA/CUI or something. That's where they maintain a CUI registry. And I think it's helpful this is one of the things we go over in the in the day-long class, is that CUI registry defines what can be protected. All the way back to that Obama executive order, one of the animating principles is they said, you know, we can't have people making up different categories of information. If you want to protect it, it's got to be pursuant to law, regulation, or government-wide policy. And if it's not pursuant to one of those things, you cannot impose restrictions on it. Well, export-controlled information is controlled by law and regulation, and therefore it is a class of CUI, which you can go to the NARA CUI registry, and you can see what the controls you're supposed to have in place are for that particular flavor of controlled unclassified information.
All right, I just brought it up so you can see that.
Yep, archives.gov/CUI, and that gets you to that. I mean, this is the per binding regulation, which is the NARA CUI rule. This is the only authoritative registry of what can be called controlled unclassified information. What's important is DoD, which has a slightly different term, covered defense information. Covered defense information, as shown on the slide that's got kind of the pie that's cut up into 3 pieces, it does include CUI government-wide. So if it's, even though it's not DoD's, you know, unclassified technical information like drawings and stuff like that, if it's you know, law enforcement information or whatever, if you're going to have it in the performance of a DoD contract, it's covered by this rule.
Okay. Another question Nicole asks, legacy export controlled information already in possession, should that be treated as CUI as well?
Yeah, this was one of the biggest problems people had back in 2015 when there was an interim rule, 2017 when the rule had its current shape and effect, was, what do you mean? Do I have to go back through all my systems and like audit all of them and find this information and segregate it and whatever? I mean, as a practical matter, boiling the ocean to go find it is not really feasible. And I think it probably wouldn't be my first priority. And query whether you have that CUI pursuant to a contract that requires you to protect it, right? So because it's been in my information systems for a decade, I probably was required to protect it pursuant to law, regulation, or government-wide policy back then, because that, you know, that law that said I shall protect export controlled information, you know, that exists independent of, or HIPAA exists independent of this CUI rule. So if I had some obligation back then, I probably should meet it. But I don't think that this new rule, including the latest iteration of the Dfar's view of CUI, means you have to go boil the ocean and look through every information system you own for a decade-old material.
Okay. Jeff, I don't see any other questions coming in. Unless there is, we got a couple more minutes if anybody wants to ask a question. In the meantime, I got to do one of these polling questions. So for accreditation purposes. So let me launch one of those polling questions. Do you have confidence your suppliers are taking cybersecurity seriously? And Alan asked the question, Trump's EO?
Was that the whole question?
Yeah.
I'm not sure which executive order, if he's got an EO number, I can look at it, but.
Right. All right, I will close the poll. So here's what people are saying. Do you have confidence your suppliers are taking cybersecurity seriously? Split, maybe 45%. Interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty consistent, I think, with what I hear when I talk to clients. I talk to clients in lots of different kind of postures. And one of the ways I talk to clients is when they're getting ready for to sell themselves in a transaction. And that has turned out to be, I think, the most likely time that people get serious about this, because whoever's going to purchase that company doesn't want to buy assets that are going to have either risk from cyber risk or compliance risk in that they haven't been acting consistent with, don't have the controls in place consistent with the CUI regulation with 800-171. So I do see a lot of companies, when it's time to put themselves on the market, rushing to get some outside help to get themselves up to speed. And as Tim said, and I'm sure others have said before this, there is absolutely no reason to wait. I guess, I've already predicted that this is not going to change that much under a new administration. I also don't think this is going to change much for non-DoD federal government entities. I don't think you can say, well, I'll wait and figure out what different set of rules are going to apply to civilian agencies. I think for better or for worse, probably for better and for worse, these requirements that you see DoD out in the front on, there's going to be course corrections from those, but there's not going to be some completely different scheme that applies to civilian agency contracts, or at least I hope there's not, and all indications are that there won't be, that it'll also incorporate 800-171, because remember, that's one of the whole animating purposes is let's deal with all this information the same way. Let's not have you doing it your way and you doing it your way, and we'll all figure it out in the end. It should be a kind of a uniform approach, and that's what the 800-171 sets up.
Yes. Here's a question. Alan Ree asked a question on this. Trump's executive order on strengthening and the cybersecurity of federal networks and CI was not on the list.
Right. So that was a more recent executive order, which I don't think changed. Certainly didn't change anything that affects these rules. So it was consistent with what prior policy has been.
Okay. All right. That looks like it concludes all of our questions we have. So, Jeff, I appreciate your time. Thank you for your insight on this and being a part of this program. We hope to see you again, and we hope to see you in a classroom real soon. So,
yeah. Well, thanks to Federal Publication Seminars. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you. Have a great day. I'm going to turn this over now, back over to Elizabeth, soon as she comes on, and we're going to go with right into the next session, which is the cybersecurity and insurance, the elephant in the room. Elizabeth, are you there?
Great.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye.
Yeah, no, that was a great session. And I think that we're actually ready to go on. I did see Monique hop on a little bit ago. Hey, Monique, how are ya? Oh, you're on mute. And there's Melissa.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi. So we have the pleasure of having two of our kind of guest star panelists from Uniting Women in Cyber that we ran 2 weeks ago, back again for another co-production with FedPubs. And this time I'm really excited to introduce Melissa Ventrone from Clark Hill and Monique Ferraro, the Cyber Counsel for HSB, to do a fireside chat. Ladies, I know you have a lot to talk to us about cyber insurance, and I've heard this term many times about cyber insurance is the elephant in the room, right? It's like coming down to brass tacks. Let's talk about this finally. So I'm glad to get started with you guys. We can start a couple minutes early and just get the conversation going. So I think Monique and Melissa, you both said you could kind of go back and forth. So we'll just hand it directly over to you unless you have any questions for us.
No, I think we're ready to start.
I have one question. I got a phone question to ask the audience before you start, because I think it's something that you'd be interested in hearing the answers to. So let me launch that polling question. So, do you believe your organization is properly insured for cybersecurity? Give another 10 seconds and I'll close this poll and we'll look at the answers. All right, I'm going to close the poll. Here's what they say. Yes, no, and unsure, about the same.
Oh, I think there'll be less unsureness after this session. So I'll hand it over to you, ladies. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and I'll go ahead and kick it off. So thanks for having us. Monique and I were preparing for this discussion recently and outlining some talking points, and then we kept evolving, if you will, into different rabbit holes because this is a really interesting topic, and I think that it can be substantially misunderstood for people who aren't familiar with cyber insurance and what's available. As Elizabeth said, my name is Melissa Van Troen. I am with Clark Hill. I run Clark Hill's Data Privacy and Cybersecurity Practice Group. We actually work with companies, I guess, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on the way that you think about it, with data security incidents and cyber attacks all day, every day. I think our team at this point has handled well over 3,000, 4,000 incidents, everything from ransomware to business email compromise. And this is such an important topic too, because in addition to the discussions that we have on security risks and governance and having the right tools and personnel resources, and organizations should definitely have insurance. It offers, I think, another tool in the organization's toolbox and being able to respond to different types of attacks in an effective and efficient manner where it won't really impact your bottom line. So in other words, insurance is a way to really help out with that. There's a lot of statistics out there right now about different types of attacks. We've seen statistics out there about ransomware attacks. I think one of the most recent statistics I saw was in the near future, companies will be hit by ransomware attacks, or a new company will be hit by a ransomware attack once every 11 seconds. So, even since we've been on here, there's been 3 or 4 new companies hit by ransomware attacks. And they're getting more expensive and more catastrophic from a damage perspective to the organization. I mean, Monique, from your perspective, what are some of the unique challenges facing critical infrastructure and government organizations?
Well, some of the big issues, of course, are funding, right? And funding relates to how much you can invest in your IT security, as well as how much you can invest in cyber insurance. And you really need both, right? And, unfortunately, because government entities are so transparent, that it's very easy to find out, what their IT systems look like, what their vulnerabilities might be, and what cyber insurance they have. You and I were talking the other day about a city that we know has been hit before with a significant attack, that there was a headline about them renewing their cyber insurance policy and the amount that it was insured for, and that makes it a great target. I mean, you already know how much is going to be paid out, so why not go back for more?
Well, and I think, Monique, too, one of the things we talked about with the recent attacks, and I think it's important to talk about ransomware because it's been so prolific recently, is the amount really that you're looking at from a response perspective. So, across the board, regardless of whether you're talking about government entities or critical infrastructure, the risks don't really change across the board. I mean, you still have business email compromise, human error, failure to set up the backups right, or the backups fail, or you have an insider threat, or something happens to a vendor that impacts you from a supply chain perspective. I mean, kind of the concept of these types of risks are the same. I think the cost of the risks might change a little bit. So from the government perspective, the costs of the risks really are more played out in the public, because everything seems to be very public. subject to FOIA attacks, or I guess FOIA requests. They're not attacks, FOIA requests quite frequently. But ransomware attacks right now, I mean, I don't know what you're seeing, but what we're seeing is an increase in the amount. So attackers will get into the environment, they'll look for an insurance policy, and then the demand for decrypting or for not, disclosing data is the amount of the insurance policy. I mean, what are some of the amounts that you've seen from a demand perspective?
Well, HSB has, we have a portfolio product that is, by and large, far and away, our biggest market, right? And we tend to have lower limits on that. And so the ransomware demands that we're seeing are much smaller than you see with larger enterprises that have big stacks of cyber insurance, right? So we deal with much smaller enterprises, like our portfolio product generally is an endorsement to a business owner's policy. So, it's going to be a turnover of less than 10 million a year, right? So we're not seeing outrageous demands, but, we do see the occasional. What we do see is more complex, more sophisticated attacks that are, not just ransomware, right? It's ransomware, it's a business email compromise, and there'll be a data breach as well. So it'll hit, all of the coverages that we have almost, and that's a challenge because they keep on coming back for more, and it exhausts the limit.
Well, and I think we've seen a multitude of attacks that request or demand 10 million. I think the highest we've seen is 33 million was the highest demand. And, when you're looking at the government contracting or the critical infrastructure or the government space, I think one of the things that makes this even more complex and more expensive is all of the other questions you have to answer with ITAR and EAR and trusted data and those types of things. So we're not dealing just with a response to some sort of an attack. Nowadays, we see the ransomware attack coupled with data extortion. We've seen it coupled with DDoS attacks. Even for companies who have backups, there might be a reason to pay the ransom because they don't want the data to get out. And when you're talking about that highly sensitive data like ITAR, EAR, trusted data, the attackers are starting to realize that there's a higher value on that type of information, and their demands are going up in accordance with that type of knowledge. I mean, they continue to learn from, and I guess we do ourselves a bit of damage here. We continue to talk about it and write about it and do panels on it, and they're, who knows, they're listening to everything that we're saying and they're learning about it as well.
Sure they are. And, we're seeing more of the double, triple extortion. They'll extort you for the ransomware of initial request where they're demanding money for the decryption keys. Sometimes they give, all of the decryption keys that you need, sometimes not. So they'll come back for more. They're like, oh, well, we thought you just wanted a decryption key for this, and if you want all of them, you're going to have to pay us more. And then there's, the extortion demand for, there's the proof of life that they put on a blog or a website, saying, oh, well, we attacked this target and here's a sample of their data. And that shows that they've definitely extricated at least some data. They may have, all of your data, you don't know yet. And it takes an investigation to determine that. So they'll say, well, we need X amount of money in order for us to delete all of this data so that we're not going to use it again. And who knows whether they're going to do that or not. And one of the things that I find striking in the whole ransomware space, with the bad actors, as they're called, is that there's sort of there's an integrity amongst the bad actors, right? Where they have a business reputation to stand by, and that is, well, we'll give you customer service and we'll give you, your data back, and we guarantee that we're going to give you your data back, and we guarantee that we're going to delete the data. But, you know, these guys are bad guys, you know, so it's very difficult to trust them.
You know, because you've always got funny war stories. I've got some funny war stories on that. In fact, you know, we had problems with one decryptor that the attacker gave us, and they offered to hack back into our environment and fix it for us. Like, oh, no, please don't. We'll figure this out and work through it. There's also stories out there about attackers who aren't willing to honor the promise, I guess, for what it's worth, that they made to provide the decryptor. And we've heard that there's other attackers that will then put them out of business because, like you said, this is a business model for them. If people are paying for the decryption or for the not releasing the data, and then the decryptor doesn't work, and then they're releasing the data, people stop paying. And they're interested in making sure that they get the money. I mean, from an insurance perspective, you know, I'm assuming, the ones that I work with, I think, most policies are covering this, correct?
Yeah, most are covering extortion and business email compromise. You know, that pretty much is table stakes now. The thing that we discuss quite often is, you know, how much does having this kind of insurance, how much does it contribute to the threat, right? Does it increase it? Does it impact it at all? And, you know, sure, it may have some impact on how often we see it, the severity, you know, as we discussed before, you know, the attackers will go in, they'll surveil the system, and they'll, you know, determine whether you have cyber insurance or not, and then what your limit is, right? And, you know, that's bad. But the alternative is, in many cases, because, you know, the backups or you know, your backup system is 10 years old, you never even tried it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You keep on backing stuff up, but you didn't test the backups, right? And when you go to test to see whether that works or not, and it doesn't work so well. So, you know, those are big factors. And, you know, a ransomware attack where all your data is encrypted, you can't access the internet, you can't access your client files, you don't know who works for you anymore, you can't pay them because you don't know who really works for you. So, you know, it's a critical juncture, and, you know, businesses don't really have the option at that point. You know, they either have to pay or determine that they're not going to pay. And if they're not going to pay, that becomes an expensive proposition if they have to rebuild all of their data.
Well, I think, Monique, that's an interesting point. I mean, the amount of times we've worked with companies and they said, oh, yes, we have backups. And then we ask them, well, are they good? And then they go, look, and they're like, well, something failed, and apparently our last backup is 7 months ago. Or something failed in the drive, and so the backup doesn't work. Or it takes us, we have 250 servers, and it takes us 14 hours to just restore one server. That's without taking care of the configurations. And we're losing $150,000 a day. Thus, it's cheaper to pay for the decryptor than it is to restore from backup because they never tested it. Or I just have too many stories, right? Or they'll get in and they encrypt the backup, or they'll look for how you connect the backup and delete it. They'll just do a variety of different things, really, to make it impossible for the business to go on without paying for that decryptor. You know, when this first came out, we used to see a lot of requirements prior to insurance actually paying for the decryptor. Are you still seeing that in a lot of policies?
No, I mean, the big thing that is the requirement that everybody observes is the Ofac requirement, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't know of any insurer that doesn't work with a trusted partner that they know is checking the Ofac sanctions list and is doing the right thing as far as that goes. One of the difficulties, of course, is you know, if the bad actor is on the sanctions list, you can't pay them, and then you have to start from scratch.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point. So the Ofac guidance that came out, it all blurs together since we're all working from home so often in the last couple of months. You know, there was a lot of flurry and discussion about that and how is it going to change things. in reviewing that Ofac guidance, it was really just a restatement of the requirements that are pretty much already in place. You can't pay somebody who's on a sanctions list. So you need to make sure you run the sanctions check, that you're checking all of the different areas that are required. But there is a process in there for if they are on a sanctions list, there is supposedly a process where you can notify law enforcement, and you work with I think it's Department of Treasury who issued that. But it's not clear to me what that process looks like, nor how long it would take. And when we're talking about a company that is down, being down days and months, weeks are extremely expensive. So while they have sort of outlined a process, I don't know that it's 100% clear if somebody is on the sanctions list. They have said that if somebody does pay somebody who is on the sanctions list, they will certainly take into consideration notification to law enforcement and all of that. But from my perspective, I haven't heard of anyone actually going through that process yet. So it'll be interesting, and hopefully it's not one of my clients that have to do that for their first test case. But I look for that in the news with a great deal of interest.
Sure. That points up the importance of having an incident response plan, having an incident response team in place, having sufficient backups, testing them, and when you have an incident response plan, it needs to be tested, just like we're talking about testing your backups and making sure that they work. You need to test your incident response plan to make sure that that works. Make sure that it's not something that's online or something that's on your system, because, even though it might be on there somewhere, you want to have a paper copy, because, if you've got everybody's phone numbers and addresses and, the team information on there, you're not going to be able to contact them if you can't access that, right? So you need to have some things that are offline and are actually, you can reach out and touch them and flip through them and find out people's cell phone numbers, because you're not going to be able to email them. You're not going to be able to, email their corporate address. That's all over, So when you're running around with your hair on fire, that is not the time to try to figure out what somebody's mobile phone number is.
I think that's a very good point. And that actually raises another thought that I think we can talk about a little bit is, I think a lot of people think of insurance as this paper document and pot of money potentially that you call on when you have problems. But I think cyber insurance is really different from other products because it brings so many other tools to the table that companies can take advantage of. And I think that many companies aren't aware of it. For instance, some have policies and procedures that you can get. Others have external scans. Are you aware of any other kind of tools or techniques that some of the insurance companies are bringing to the table for this product?
I think that one of the confusing things about cyber insurance is that there are a lot of services and information that come along with the policy. For instance, there might be an inside-out scan, an outside-in scan, a website or portal that has downloadable templates for incident response plans and, like mobile device policies and stuff like that. And it's important to check it out and to gauge sort of, are you going to use it or not, and make a commitment to use those risk mitigation tools, because it's not similar. It's not like even in the same universe as, say, you're buying auto insurance, right? When you buy auto insurance, almost all of the auto insurers have a handy dandy website that you can go and you can learn how to mitigate your risks and how to drive more safely. And I can tell you that I have never been on that website.
I didn't even know they had it.
Oh yeah. And you can also get this thing that plugs into your car and it tells you whether you're a good driver or not, and it can offer you a discount if you're a good driver. I know better than that because I'm a bad driver, and I admit that freely. And anyone in my family or anybody who's ever driven with me will tell you that, right? But cyber insurance is different, right? And you can really minimize your risk, which is very, important. I mean, that is a cratering event in many cases. If you don't have, if you don't have sufficient security and you're hit with a ransomware attack, and it's going to take you out for a couple of months, and they do. I mean, you're in the response realm, so I'm sure that you've seen attacks that go on for more than 2 weeks at a time. 2 weeks is a long time to be down.
It really is, and I think people don't, when I always talk about it, when you're walking by a building, you can tell if there's been a fire in the building. You're walking by a server and you can't tell all the things that are going wrong with that server. It just looks like a regular box. So, the whole process of getting insurance, I've heard discussions and complaints sometimes, right, that the applications are like 5 questions, or the applications are long, depending on where you sit kind of in small, mid, and larger markets. But when we're looking at CMMC and rolling that out, the new defense contractor kind of rolled out the new defense contractor compliance requirements, do you anticipate that insurance companies who are insuring those types of entities are going to add that to the application to ask if they're compliant or not? Have you seen that from like the healthcare side?
Well, we don't parse out, the occupancy or, the type of business that an entity is in, and target them for different questions, right? So everybody pretty much gets the same application, or they don't get an application at all. That's the way that we do our portfolio product. Is there's no application, because it's got lower limits. But what you find is that the higher the limits, the more intense the underwriting is going to be, right? And there may be an associated outside in and inside out scan that goes along with a questionnaire. And the questionnaire may have 5 questions, may have 20 questions. I've seen applications that were 20 pages long. And, at that point, you've got to get everybody involved in it. You've got to get legal involved. You've got your IT people involved. You've got your financial people involved, because it's a pretty fulsome application. And, whether that accurately reflects the degree of risk or not, I don't know. I don't know. We don't have that much claims experience. I mean, our company does have a great deal of claims information, but that's only 10 years, right? When you talk about fires or theft or any of your traditional, auto policies, you've got easily 100 years worth of claims experience that you can draw on for underwriting. In cyber, it's sort of crapshoot, and the threats evolve, and the threat landscape, the targets evolve, right? As you get different security software, different security technology, and then you've got different operating systems. So the operating systems are constantly changing. It's not like a car where you get a big technological improvement that reduces risk substantially, like the lane detection things, right? Or an airbag. The airbags were a big deal. They changed, a lot of underwriting for auto, right? But with cyber, not everybody has that, or you can't just say, did you buy your computer system in 2020? And, rest assured that they're in good stead, because who knows? Who knows what they did? There's so much of their security depends on whether they configured it correctly, whether they've got updates, they install updates and patches on a regular cadence. There's so much that goes into cyber that, makes it less certain when you're underwriting.
When I think of it a little bit like, PCI or payment card industry compliance, right? A lot of the applications don't go through and say, are you PCI compliant? And those that do, PCI compliance is a snapshot in time. You may be PCI compliant at the time that you do the assessment, but if something small changes, it could bring you out of compliance, or there's an error or something like that. So I think even if insurance policies ask about CMMC compliance, it's not determinative on whether coverage is afforded or not. I think it's going to be an interesting.
I'm sorry. So much of that, like that, the data transfer. What is the name of that program? It was Safe Harbor. Now it is, under GDPR.
Well, that went away too. What is it? The Shield.
Privacy Shield.
Yes.
Like Privacy Shield, and so many of those programs, along with PCI compliance, they're all voluntary, and they're all self-report. So,
Yep.
If somebody's going to lie to you on their application, that would be the kind of thing that they would lie about, and you don't find out that they weren't PCI compliant or that they didn't have the appropriate controls in place until after the incident.
Well, so Monica, I'm not an insurance attorney. I help the companies when they get hit by cyber attacks. And so I rarely have a captive audience. And I really want to ask a couple questions on things that I've kind of wondered about. So I keep hearing this discussion about silent cyber. And I kind of sort of know what it is, but I mean, what is that what is silent cyber when you're talking about it from a policy perspective, and why does it matter?
Well, silent cyber is important because it affects not cyber insurance necessarily. It affects the different lines of insurance that an insurer offers. And, what usually happens is that there'll be a cyber incident that has an impact, and then, the insured will look to their cyber insurance policy, or more than likely, in most cases, they don't have a cyber insurance policy, and they try to find cover under something else, like their CGL policy or a property policy. And, that has been, in some cases, successful. There's a case of National Ink and Stitch, and in that case, what happened was there was a cyber attack. It was a ransomware attack, and the insured had an older policy that only covered data breach, right? So what happens in those kind of cases where you have an old policy like that is, the insurer will pay for the investigation to see if it's a data breach or not. Once they find out that it's not a data breach, everything stops, right? So no more investigation, not paying for remediation, you're all done, right? And that's what happened in that case. So once the insured got to that point where they found out, okay, well, this isn't covered under my cyber policy, they quick, fast, in a hurry installed there's some security software, right? The security software, because the system hadn't been fully remediated, was very slow, right? Because, if you don't fix everything, your operating system doesn't work the way that it used to work, right? So, that installation happened, slowed the system down, so the insured argued that they needed to have a new system, right? And that they argued that the ransomware affected their property, and they tried to say that, our property insurance should cover this. Well, as you know, being a lawyer and stuff, when you go to court, right, you might have like a great case, and your case may say, you have a perfect argument of, here's the policy doesn't cover this, right? Definitely doesn't cover it. And the judge says, well, nice guys over there, and, they didn't know, and, they should have been told that the policy didn't cover this or something. And that's what happened in that case, pretty much. But, if you have a current policy, it is going to cover ransomware. Your current policies are going to have exclusions that exclude like a silent cyber kind of risk like that.
Well, and so, you just talked about a property policy that ended up paying for, some sort of recovery for a ransomware attack. I mean, okay, for those companies out there that don't have cyber insurance, obviously some of these other policies are covering it. Why do they need cyber insurance?
Oh, because it costs a lot of money to go to court, right? And you're not guaranteed a positive outcome, right? And this isn't the kind of case that anybody's going to take on a contingency basis, right? You don't go to an attorney and say, well, you know, I'd like for you to make sure that I get coverage under my property policy because my cyber policy or my absence of a policy doesn't cover it. So I'm out, and that means that I have no money anyway, right? And I want you to sue my insurer and try to get coverage under this. It's a hard road to go down, first of all. Secondly, you want to have insurance that'll remediate your situation and get you back up and running right away, unless you've got some kind of reserve that is going to enable you to do that. You know, small, mid-sized, and even moderately sized enterprises just don't have that right now. So it's a much better plan to, you know, have your commercial general liability policy, have your property and personal property policy, and also have a cyber policy, whether it's an endorsement or it's a standalone. You need to have that. You need to read your policies, know what's going to be covered. And while certainly you can't plan for every eventuality, you need to make sure that you've got the coverage in place. Otherwise, you're going to be out of pocket, and you may be shut down.
So, I mean, we're talking technology, we're talking cyber, right? That's super expensive, isn't it? I mean, how much are policies, what does a market look right now for kind of a small to mid-sized company when you're looking at the cost of another insurance policy?
It depends on the size of the risk and the size of the limit, right? So, you know, it's not one size fits all, but you could go anywhere from a couple of $100, you know, for $100,000 limit to, you know, a couple of $1,000s for, you know, $1 million limit or a couple of $1 million, right? And, you know, this requires, just in any other risk management field, looking at what kind of information you have, you know, how many different points you have on your network, how critical the data is to you, you know, because for the most part, a lot of times when you do an investigation, you find, you know what, we don't really need this information. It's not critical to moving forward. We could just start over. But there are, you know, definitely critical information. You know, there's intellectual property, there's personal information, there's personal health information that, you know, you need to have, but not everything needs to be saved forever. And you need to know what kind of information you have, where it's stored, how it's backed up, and, you know, do that kind of basic knowledge. And it's surprising, you know, and you must see this all the time as an incident responder. It is surprising to me that companies have no idea how many endpoints they have. They have no idea what kind of information they have, or, you know, what their employees are actually doing. You know, are they emailing PII, you know, and if so, you know, are you doing anything about that? You know, what are your protections? Where's your encryption? I don't know how many times, like in my career, I've asked people, do you encrypt data at rest and in transit? Yeah, we do. And I'm like, okay, you know, do you really, you know?
Yeah, no, I know. I think there's a big misunderstanding too, when I think because all the news talks about, you know, the Home Depots and the Targets and the ransomware attacks on, you know, municipalities and big organizations, the Marriott breaches. I think there's, for your small and mid-size, there's a thought out there that, hey, they're really targeting these large organizations. I'm not really at risk. And if I am at risk, it's not, you know, it's not going to cost that much. What's the big deal? But you know, the news likes things that people find interesting and they talk about it. And so for every single large incident out there that you see in the news, there's 100, 150, 200, 300 smaller incidents that never make the news, that you never see anyone talk about. It's amazing, I think, how often the small and mid-sized companies are targets, because the attackers have automated the process. They've automated the attacks. They know sometimes when the vulnerabilities are hitting the news prior to a company, and they actually go out and they'll run automated scripts to identify those organizations with vulnerabilities, post that list on the dark web, and other attackers can go out and perpetrate attacks exploiting those vulnerabilities. That's what they do. And the cost to recover from an incident, I mean, when you're looking at it from gaining the visibility across your network, doing the monitoring, conducting the forensics, I mean, even if we're talking about a small company that has about 20, 25 devices, so real small, we're still talking $50, $60, $70,000 to do simply the forensic investigation. And then if you have public relation costs, if you have legal costs, if you have that, just add, so you're talking over $100,000, you know, and you haven't even gotten all the way through everything, any kind of third-party demands or anything along those lines, especially if you interrupt service or something like that. So the cost can add up very, very quickly. And I think, you know, what a lot of people don't realize is that's what cyber insurance is uniquely set up to help provide and address. I mean, you know, almost every carrier out there, I think, has gone through and done a due diligence process on the different vendors. So they know the vendors that specialize in the incident response forensics. They know the ones that specialize in the restoration. They know the law firms who, you know, do this 24/7. They know the crisis communication that are out there. And so instead of having for those companies to have the need to start making phone calls and figuring out and hoping they don't get, you know, my Uncle Vinny's software company out of the garage, reaching out to the carrier is a way to really utilize that partnership so that you can respond more quickly, more effectively, more efficiently, and less expensively. And I think that's something that a lot of organizations don't necessarily haven't really understood or talked about with their broker.
Yeah, and I think that cyber insurers could do a better job explaining everything that comes along with your policy when you get one, right? And what you bring up is very important and critical in the cyber insurance realm. We do have those relationships. We have vetted the vendors. We have negotiated pricing for our insureds, right? So when someone goes out and, you know, has an incident without the backup of a cyber insurance policy and good claims examiners, right? Because that's another part of it. Your claims adjusters are going to be an invaluable resource because they can direct the insured to the proper resources. And, you know, without that, it's unlike anything else, really. You know, it's similar to when you have an auto accident and your auto insurer says, well, we have a list of, you know, these places. You don't have to go to them. You know, you don't have to, but we recommend them because of their pricing, you know, or because they have a solid reputation with us, right? And that's what we do it across a whole bunch of different areas, you know, and like you were mentioning, you've got the legal expense, you've got the forensics, you've got system restoration, which is separate and usually the most expensive part of it. Then you've got betterment because you don't want to be attacked the same way that you were attacked last time. You've got, you know, a whole host of resources, public relations, crisis communications, you know, the whole Medilla. So,
you know, we talked a little bit about the policy and the tools, and I think the resources that the carrier brings to the table from a relationship perspective. I mean, when you're looking at government and critical infrastructure, do you think there are particular gaps in cyber policies as it relates to those particular industries that companies should be aware of?
I don't think that there's gaps in the policies. I think that there are vulnerabilities that are common to government entities and, you know, for instance, schools and smaller governments they tend to, be less secure because, they have farmed out their IT to somebody's, ne'er-do-well nephew who, happens to know something about IT. And so they hire them to do that. And it can create a vulnerability when you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I was working with a new client recently who had a business email compromise. And so, we know the vendors that work in the space. We set up a call and then get the statement of work. And then they call me and they said, well, we have this managed service provider that we're looking at, that we're thinking about potentially going with, and we want to see if we can use them. I'm like, that's not a good idea. That's a really bad idea because they specialize in the, the managed service part. And then they probably have one guy in the back room who occasionally does forensics. And so this isn't their bread and butter. This isn't what they do. Luckily, they listen to us, but sometimes you get involved in a situation where the client has hired forensics before you're involved, and you're halfway down the road, and it's apparent that they don't necessarily know exactly what they're doing. And the problem is then you can't determine with certainty what occurred, and trying to help that organization then lock down those vulnerabilities to make sure it doesn't happen again, I think is particularly frustrating.
Yes. And, one of the things that many, across business and government, and schools, one of the common things, one of the common rationalizations for not getting cyber insurance is, well, we've got our own IT department and we've got Joe who knows how to do forensics, right? Well, if you have an incident, right, there's going to be a need for your IT people to do stuff, but you need outside people to, really help out. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Number one, you shouldn't expend your resources internally on conducting investigations and, remediating the system completely, right? Certainly there's a role for the internal people, but, in order to preserve the evidence, document the case, find out the sources, you really want to have an objective, company in there that's got experience that is going to, preserve the evidence properly. It's going to be able to testify if necessary. And not for nothing, I don't know, I'm sure you've seen it before, because I know I've seen it. They have an internal investigation, and then, oh, surprise, they find, the bad actor, and they prosecute the bad actor. And then whoever your internal resource is, it has to go off site to testify, in some remote place in the United States for a month at a time. That's not what you plan for.
Hey, Elizabeth, are we running out of time?
Yeah, we're actually almost at time, but as having a panelist link, I can't always ask the questions directly, so I thought I'd hop on because I did have a question to ask myself. First of all, great session, ladies. Really interesting stuff, and a lot of things that we tend not to think about, or we don't want to think about, or we hope that no one will make us think about. So we're glad to have those insights from you. I wanted to go back to something that you all talked about briefly around CMMC. And we did have, I'm not sure if either of you ladies caught the session we had earlier today with Katie Arrington, where she talked explicitly about insurance being an important component. Do you all see, for example, NEO is we're a managed security provider, so we have a solution in the space. And I'm wondering if you're seeing other providers or just insurance providers by themselves try to position themselves within the CMMC space to provide those services directly for the smaller businesses. Are you seeing that happening? Not so much? Is there a degree of awareness from the smaller supply chain for that need?
So I'll speak to it from my perspective. I mean, I haven't seen an adaptation in the products that insurance companies are offering specifically targeted to CMMC. I think, you know, CMMC is a compliance paradigm, if you were a model, similar to PCI compliance or HIPAA compliance or things along those lines. I think we may eventually see similar guides or things like that to assist companies with understanding their compliance requirements. But a lot of times it seems, from my perspective, that the insurance companies may partner with other companies who offer certifications in those areas. And I think that, you know, unlike NIST and some other frameworks out there, CMMC will eventually have that compliance requirement. I think the interesting thing there is going to be the fact that CMMC and the way that it's rolling out, if I recall correctly, they're controlling who can actually do those certifications. So, and they have to be independent. And so whether or not there can be a relationship with the insurance company on that side, I think is going to be something that develops down the road. Regardless of whether somebody is CMMC compliant or not, an incident happens or a ransomware attack happens or, you know, an exploit of a vulnerability happens, the insurance is going to respond to the security incident or the data breach the same way it would if the company was CMMC compliant or not. So I think it's an interesting discussion. I think too, from my perspective, especially with your larger insurance companies, I think they like to see, I think they like to get a little more involved when things are a little more certain. And there's a lot of uncertainty right now on how CMMC is really, like, when is it really going to be rolled out? How is it really going to be implemented? How many people are going to be able to do the certifications and those types of things? And so we might see more discussion in the insurance space as we get a little bit more firmed up on what that product or that requirement and implementation looks like. That's just my thoughts on it.
And you might see that insurers are willing to offer discounts for, you know, companies that are certified, you know, because whether or not they follow a framework, whether or not they have, you know, different certifications, like they're PCI compliant, you know, that can enter into, you know, the underwriting decision making and can help to reduce the premium. But there's a lot going on in the InsurTech space, and there's all kinds of marriages that are happening, you know, where you've got InsurTech partnering with insurers, and, you know, you can get cyber insurance online with a couple of clicks, and, you know, there's all kinds of stuff happening.
Some really interesting stuff. Well, thank you so much, Monique and Melissa, for joining us today for the session. I really learned a lot. It was very valuable. So we're grateful for your insights. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having me. And Melissa, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for facilitating.
All right, we're going to be moving on here. We got a 15-minute break, but before we go to break, I want to do another polling question, and then we'll hit the break. So I was looking through getting ready for this program, and I came across an article from a company called CSO, or online magazine publication. They asked who's had the biggest data breach so far. I would say so far. See if anybody knows what they say. All these were on their list, but the biggest one, I think, surprised me. But I'll give it another 10 seconds and I'll close this poll, show the results. All right, I'm going to close the poll. So 67% said Equifax, 18% said Marriott. But let me bring this up. Hold on one second. Oh, let me close out the poll, because that is actually wrong. Share my webcam. So hold on one second. Boom, boom. Clean. And let me pull this over. The actual biggest data breach was Adobe. 2013. So Marriott International was down here number 9. Equifax was down here number 6. So Adobe happened October 2013, 153 million users. So I thought that was very interesting. All right, well, we'll take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at we'll take about 11-minute break now. So we'll come back at 3 o'clock, and we'll come back to our last session of the day, which is going to be on cyber warfare. We'll have Casey Fleming, Chris Neeson, Mark Montgomery, Kristen Lovejoy, and Edward Yu joining us. So we'll see you in 15 or 10 minutes.
Last session. All of us going to come out of it, so we're going to go. Everybody, welcome to this last and closing session for this year's NEO FedCup Cybersecurity Summit. One of my personal favorites, although all of them are my favorite, but this one is really going to be almost over the top with information, so please make sure you have your notes ready. So this is going to be on cyber warfare. It will be moderated by Casey Fleming, Chairman and CEO of Black Ops Group Corporation. And our panelists today are Chris Nissen, Head of Asymmetric Threat for MITRE, Mark Montgomery, the Executive Director for U.S. Cyberspace Commission, Chris Lovejoy, the Global Cybersecurity Lead for E&Y, who was our guest 2 weeks ago on Uniting Women in Cyber, and Edward Yu, Supervisor Special Agent, Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, FBI. Gosh, guys, this is going to be amazing. So let's get started. I think this is really exciting. I'm going to pop off, Casey, and hand it over to you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Elizabeth. First, I'd like to welcome our panel. To all the audience that's out there today, the panel that we have put in front of you, actually, NEO has put in front of you, is a very strong panel with a lot of horsepower. So our goal is to walk you through where we've been in cybersecurity in 2020 and really where we're headed in 2021 and beyond. So we're going to look at the big picture. There's a much bigger picture than cybersecurity. Cybersecurity fits into this other picture. We'll discuss that and really how cybersecurity enables and fits into hybrid warfare or asymmetric warfare. Big word, but it affects all of us. And one thing that we suffer from in cybersecurity is tunnel vision and our overconfidence on technology. Our summary, if we do our job together today on this panel, we're going to lead you to the summary and conclusion of success and survival requires the uniting or the unification of risk, strategy, and the human factor. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a glossary of terms, and Chris Nissen will help with this and explode those even further. But asymmetric hybrid warfare, my recommendation is to grab the book, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, to understand that more deeply and to really what that framing is. Hybrid warfare, unrestricted warfare. There's actually a book that you can Google by 2 Chinese colonels that came out in 1999, and they were colonels in the PLA, People's Liberation Army. We'll also discuss the gray zone, and Mark Montgomery is going to go into more detail on the gray zone as well. But back to our panel of experts. I'd absolutely like to thank them for their time today. Mark Montgomery, Executive Director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Chris Nissen, Head of Asymmetric Threat and Supply Chain Strategy for the MITRE Corporation. Kristen Lovejoy, Global Head of Cybersecurity for E&Y. Edward Yu, a very special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the liaison officer at the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of National Security. So to get started, Chris, can you help us understand what are some of the dimensions of asymmetric threat beyond cyber, please?
Sure. So I view it as a new era. Anyone who's heard my Deliver Uncompromised talk in the past has heard that many times, but you really have to think of it in that aspect to recognize the depth of the problem and the scale of the problem. Yeah, there's a slide that I used. So, you know, at a high level, you know, we recognize, you can go back different time frames, but this nation has really gone through 3 major eras. And we define them here as the nuclear era, which is underscored by strategic nuclear deterrence. There's a whole bunch of characteristics of that era on the right there, followed by the conventional era, the ability to fight 2 conventional, aka kinetic wars on 2 continents at the same time. And it was underscored by conventional deterrence. I can say that our nuclear deterrence is eroding for a number of reasons. Our conventional deterrence is eroding for a number of reasons. And I would argue that in the late 80s, early 90s, without us even recognizing it for another 20 some years, we had moved into an asymmetric, what I call an asymmetric era. And that is backed by Chinese and Russian doctrine that was literally saying that they preferred not to take on the US kinetically and would rather take us on asymmetrically. China calls it anti-symmetrically. So that's their words. We define that as there's really 4 ways to fight. Win by fighting, win by not fighting, win by not losing, and win by disrupting. So when you think of it that way, asymmetric actions are really anything but win by fighting. That's a traditional kinetic, soldier-to-soldier war. Everything else is asymmetric warfare in this definition, and they're moving in and out of those. So when you think that way, all of a sudden, South China Sea starts to make a whole lot more sense. Win by not fighting. Guerrilla warfare and ISIS is win by not losing, death by 1,000 cuts. Win by disrupting really gets interesting, and we're going to blow that out, I believe, in this panel. Cyber, IT, and IT systems and an OT systems is a major thrust of that. And one reason they would want to do that is make your system, make your capability, or make your economy, make your election, whatever you pick it, not do what it's supposed to do when it's supposed to do it. And that throws in uncertainty and the inability to really even understand maybe how you're being attacked. Hope that helps. Oh, I did want to say, one of the reasons that makes this so hard is that right now we really don't have that deterrence factor for the asymmetric era. So we're lacking that strategic deterrence. And that's sort of the North Star where we want to get to. And I think the United States has made some real progress in the past few years on starting to trace out a line toward that North Star. But that's the objective, and it's going to take a while to accomplish that.
Thank you, Chris. Would it be fair to say that asymmetric warfare or hybrid warfare is all things short of conventional warfare? Is that a good summary?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Mark, I'd like to move over to you and ask you, what is the commission saying about protecting against cyber attacks in the gray zone? What is the gray zone and why do we care?
So the commission looked at the gray zone, very specifically in the cyber, is that layer below which an adversary is taking action and it doesn't trip an escalatory response or a use of force by the United States in response. And you can think of lots of examples of this. Chinese theft of 24 million OPM records, even the DPRK's attack on Sony didn't trip, at least for at least 6 or 8 months, a formal U.S. response. When we looked at the gray zone, we said, look, this is actually where cyber deterrence isn't working. We kind of think deterrence in general works above the gray zone in the use of force area, and the idea that we have a strong cybercom with 137 cyber mission force with 137 teams and lots of kinetic capability. Nation states don't go attack our critical infrastructure and take down the Northeast power grid in peacetime, right? There's a deterrent effect going on there. Where deterrence isn't working in cyberspace is below that level of the use of force in the gray zone. And what we said was, we really have to work on this. There's 3 general areas that we go at. The first is we actually have to build defense. This weird situations come to exist where for the critical infrastructure in the United States for more than 70 years, maybe even going all the way back to 1815. We haven't had to defend it. We've had the Atlantic, 4,000 miles, the Pacific, 7,000 miles, good neighbors in Canada and Mexico. We just haven't had to defend ourselves. Cyber just removed that geographic issue for us and immediately brought us into the gray zone in cyber. The second issue, so first we have to defend ourselves, our critical infrastructure, something we just had not been doing. The United States doesn't put air defense missile systems around nuclear power plants in the all over the country, but we do have to do cyber defense. The second issue that happened was when you recognize this is that the infrastructure is owned by the private sector, and as opposed to where the government owns pretty much every submarine, fighter plane, tank that could be out there. We don't own this critical infrastructure. So we actually have to build that public-private collaboration we've given lip service to since 1999 in the first presidential decision directive on this. So build a better defense, have some public-private collaboration. But then the third and probably the most visual aspect of this is we recommended that a full-throated embrace of the idea of defend forward, not as the way it was described by the Department of Defense, but as a defend forward across all the elements of military power. So all the elements of national power, which includes your military power, but also economics, law enforcement, diplomatic. So what we said was you really have to have the right, integrated law enforcement, the indictments, economics, the sanctions, diplomatic activity, and then finally, military. And then you would use defend forward or persistent engagement. And there's been a big change in the United States over the last 3 years. In the same National Defense Authorization Act that approved the commission I'm executive director of, it also, this is under Senator McCain, his final bill, it approved something called cyber surveillance and reconnaissance as a traditional military activity. That allowed the military to become much more involved, the U.S. Cyber Command in these kind of operations. You combine that with what's called National Presidential Decision Memorandum, or National NSPM 13, which was signed by the president. That authorized the process for conducting offensive cyber operations. So you put those two things together, and you actually begin to have a credible process for executing operations to go with the credible capability of the cyber mission forces, and now we can operate more in that gray zone. So the commissions had doubled down on defending ourselves, building the public-private collaboration, and executing defend forward in the gray zone. That's how we got at it.
Thanks, Mark. So a good summary of the gray zone would be, again, everything short, all disruption, theft of IP, and just on and on and on in the gray zone, which exists between peace and war. Is that a good summary?
In about 20 seconds, that's what I said in about 4 minutes. Good job.
Hey, that's why I'm here. But no, the people needed our audience needed the detail, and we really appreciate it. So, Kristen, help ground us with Chris's and Mark's background on asymmetric warfare, gray zone, and so on. Can you give us, on a scale of 1 to 10, where is U.S. cybersecurity today in readiness and capability, in your mind, and what you see out talking to customers? And what do you think companies must do differently in 2021 and forward compared to what we've done in the past? Over to you.
That's a really good, it's a great question. So there's I'm going to answer it in a number of different ways. One is obviously with the COVID crisis, there have been some profound changes that we have to recognize have sort of changed our posture. And so the answer I would give you today is not the answer I would have given you had COVID not appeared. And so just, to be clear, if you think about how organizations typically engaged in digital transformation programs over agile or not agile, relatively long periods of time, rolling out those programs, sometimes thinking about security, sometimes not thinking about security. What we found is that organizations, particularly in the US, have transformed themselves overnight, done 10 years of innovation over the course of 6 months. They're rolling out these technologies with absolutely no security controls in and around them. So I think by virtue of the COVID pandemic and the massive sort of the iteration of innovation that has occurred, we have, by result, incurred a lot of debt, cybersecurity debt that we would not have otherwise had. So from a posture perspective, we have to recognize that. I do think, and I think one of the biggest challenges that we have on the cyber side, though, that is being exaggerated in this time frame, and that makes the U.S., I think, even weaker from a cybersecurity standpoint than we have been before, is, and it's a theme that we're seeing and we're talking a lot about, which is techno-nationalism. So if you want to call it a sort of a whiplash reaction, backlash to globalism, it is the manifestation of the popular will as a result of populism and nationalism. It's a reflection of the U.S. trade, China policy, whatever the case may be. What we're seeing in many jurisdictions is a move toward local legislation for data, to have data localization, to source locally, to require the divulgence of encryption algorithms, et cetera, access to source code. I think this is also making the U.S. weaker because there is less trust of the U.S. today that we're seeing overseas. And by nature of that distrust, what we're seeing is adoption of standards, particularly the Russian Federation and the Chinese standards, by other organizations, outside organizations that you typically wouldn't have seen. They are adhering to some of the policies. We're seeing a fragmentation of compliance requirements. We're seeing a lot more sort of compliance, just complexity, and that complexity is breeding risk. So for U.S. organizations, in order for them to compete, there's a give and a take, right? There's a cost benefit associated with going to market globally. And what we're seeing is a lot of these organizations are also just sort of pulling back on the cyber side because they have to go to market, and this is the only way they're going to compete. So I think there's sort of an erosion there that has resulted in whatever dynamic we can say that we're in today. And the other thing that I think we've done that we haven't really necessarily gotten a hand on or a handle around, that I think other nation states have done better, is in and around disinformation. I think that there are certain, and we have not, I think, on the private sector side, really come to terms with what this means. And cybersecurity in particular, if you talk to a typical CISO, they don't have any kind of control over disinformation. That's something the marketing guys do. And yet when there is a disinformation campaign, they're being brought to the table, and they're shrugging their shoulders saying, I don't know what to do about this. So I think that, again, in the US, we don't have good policies, procedures, approaches to this particular problem. And it's going to come about more and more. And then the last thing I'd say, just from makes me a little bit worried, from a corporation's perspective, there's a lot of stuff happening. There's a lot of stuff that they have to protect. And, disruptive attacks, yes, they're being woken up by the number of ransomware attacks. But I still don't think that US corporations in particular recognize the disruptive nature of or the disruptive methods by which the attackers are trying to sort of get a rise out of the organization. They're still thinking it's, most of the crime is financially motivated. It's all about IP. They're not getting it. And so, again, I think there's some work that we can do on the US side to, build some awareness. But I know I said a lot. That's kind of my 2 cents on the subject.
Thank you very much, Kristen. It gives us a great idea of where you think the U.S. is and where it's going and what we need to do as companies. I'd like to go now to Ed Yu. Ed is a special agent with the FBI, also in the healthcare vertical. And I really don't want the audience to tune out now. When you hear healthcare, that might not be your vertical, but what Ed's going to take you through applies to absolutely every vertical. So Ed, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the emerging security challenges associated with health data? Again, to our audience, please don't tune out. It's happening in your industry as well, but probably the one that is most significant that we can explain here as an example with Ed Yu and with his crow's nest version or vision of what's really going on. So Ed, I'll repeat it since I walked all over it. What are some of the emerging security challenges associated with the health data? Over to you, Ed.
Sure. So I appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity. I think I'm a little bit different from the panel. I consider myself a recovering biochemist. So I'm going to be giving you all the bio perspective. And I'll start off with this. This is a quote from FBI Director Wray. And it's important that you talked about unrestricted warfare. But his quote is, "The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality is a counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China. It's a threat to our economic security and by extension to our national security." So it's not just an economic issue, it's absolutely a national security issue. And this is where bio comes in, that right from the get-go, I want to put out that we are in the midst of a biological space race. And I don't think that we as a country recognize that we're in the middle of this race. We had a little bit of a glimmer of it in the fact that we're in the face of a pandemic. We went from the first outbreak to a vaccine in less than a year, which is remarkable. But at the end of the day, that's all based on data, right? The genetics of the virus itself, and that translated into a product. That's just a portent of things to come. And what's going to fuel this biological space race is data. It's all about the data. And when in the areas of health, it's various sources of data. So looking at ourselves, our genetic makeup. You know, the first time a human being's entire genome was fully sequenced was in 2003. And that effort took the US government 10 years and $3.5 billion to sequence one person's DNA sequence. Fast forward to today, you could do that in 24 hours, and the going rate is a couple $100. And so we are able to generate massive amounts of genetic information. But then in the area of things like precision health, you need to augment that with things like your medical records, your family history, your insurance history, even your wearable tech data, you know, tracking your heart rate, looking at how much exercise you're getting. And what the government and the private sector is doing is leveraging that data to translate that into new products, new therapies, new treatments. And so it's all about the data. Unfortunately, though, if you think about it that way, there's a really disconcerting effect in that if you look at all the historical cyber intrusions in the healthcare sector, the immediate concerns were the loss of privacy, the possibility for fraud or identity theft. I hate to say it, but from a bio perspective, I don't care so much. What's important is that it's the biologically relevant data. So, you know, looking at, as I said, your medical history, your medical insurance records, what drugs were given, what conditions have you suffered from. And most of those hacks were all perpetrated by China. And I consider that their ongoing covert or criminal acquisition of data. Unfortunately, folks, we're giving it away too. And this goes towards the asymmetric aspects of it, that in the last decade or so, China has heavily invested in the US in our biotech and pharma sector. For companies, for example, that provide commercial DNA testing, when you send in your saliva sample, you're like, ooh, I want to find out what percentage ethnicity I am, or your genealogy studies. Well, don't be surprised that if you find that many of these companies may have been invested by foreign entities, completely above board, completely legal. But do you really understand, as an individual consumer, where's your data going? How's it going to be utilized? But more importantly, who's going to have access to it? They've also established China companies that their prime business model is to sequence data at a large scale, very quickly, and most importantly, they do it cheap. And a lot of these companies, they are certified to do clinical testing. They are HIPAA compliant. They even meet or exceed NIST cybersecurity guidelines. So on paper, they look great. And they offer the lowest price point. You know, they can outbid most of our domestic companies. So as we speak across the country, hospitals, universities, companies, we're sending over blood samples, tumor samples, biopsy samples, and these companies process it. And yes, we get the genetic information, but you know what? At the end of the day, they have it too. And let alone the fact that it's happening all around the world. China is offering through their health diplomacy, field laboratories around the world to do COVID testing through DNA sequencing. And then all the while in China, they are actively collecting biometric data on their own population. There's actually an initiative that by 2025, every single newborn in China is going to be fully genetically sequenced as soon as they're born. So there's a whole generation of their data being co-opted by the government before they even have a voice. Why this is important, though, is that it is absolutely only a one-way street. China has access to data from all around the world, whether it be through theft or through legitimate collaborations or partnerships or through investments. But guess what? We don't get to see any of theirs. So through privacy laws and cybersecurity legislation they passed, it is absolutely within their control. We don't see any of that, especially even with the COVID pandemic. We don't see any of their clinical data. Why that's important is that that's a ticking time bomb. Then they are on part of the world's largest, most diverse data set that you can think of. And once they get true machine learning, true artificial intelligence, true quantum computing, they're off to the races, because they can then design, right, and new products, new approaches that I just mentioned. And it's not the issue of made in China 2025. The nightmare scenario is designed in China based on the data that they have access to, and then leveraging their telecommunications, their high performance computing infrastructure onto that data. What that means, though, is that if you look at all of our existing cybersecurity frameworks, it's looking at protecting IP, protecting patents, right? Well, that's all well and good, but the nightmare scenario is that if they have all the data and they can leverage it, then they're going to co-opt all the future IP. They'll just design it. So that means that in the future, all the future market share, business models, all the job opportunities are all going to be over there, because they had the long view. And from a bio standpoint, everything I'm just basically boiling it down to is that the nightmare scenario is not someone over there engineering a virus that could cause a zombie apocalypse, which is typically what's the nightmare scenario from a healthcare standard. But through the lack of our understanding of the true value of our data, that we're going to wake up one day and realize, well, hell, we've just become healthcare crack addicts and China has become our pusher. What happens if we suddenly realize that all of our future healthcare needs, whether it be pharmaceutics, vaccines, patient healthcare delivery, is all offered by China at a competitively low price? That becomes their new export. How do we say no to that? And along with that comes a transfer of wealth, transfer of opportunities. Where does that leave our private sector? And I focus on health, but bear in mind that biological data is not limited to just health. There's aspects of this in agriculture, in manufacturing, in alternative renewable energy from biosources. China has made strategic investments, both financially, but also from a policy standpoint, both domestic and foreign policy, and they have taps into this biological data around the world. You see them, they're doing biological prospecting. But from a US foreign policy standpoint, we're absent. So I'm afraid that this might come back to bite us if we don't look at this through not just the traditional security framework, traditional cybersecurity framework. We need to have an eye on the fact that this is the new normal. This is the revolution that the biotechnology is going to usher us into. But we're just not looking at it from a security standpoint in the way we should be. So hopefully I didn't lose people, but I'll happy to leave it there. The final thing is that if suddenly this becomes not just a data storage device, but a healthcare diagnostic, and if you think about it on a 5G network that is constantly collecting your biological data in real time, it's not about privacy now. It's what that translates into that potentially have a security implication. We need to start thinking about that today. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ed. I was hoping you were going to give us that quote from FBI Director Wray, which is a very sobering quote, and it's a very grounding quote of really what's going on. So Ed, thank you very much. Chris, I'd like to move over to you. Would you actually, we use cyber warfare kind of as a Hollywood type of moniker, cyber warfare and so on. And we're in the United States, we are conditioned to think that war is typically only uniforms, guns, ships, bombs, and rifles, right? This asymmetric warfare, it's real, and it's something that every American needs to come to grips with, because they're in this national security war. Privacy figures into that, as we just heard from Ed and the rest of the team. But would you categorize this as an absolute war?
Oh yeah, I mean, you said a few things there that can really be expanded on. you said security, and it is. I mean, what we're dealing with here is cyber is a tool. It's a tool. When we say security, we mean counterintelligence, right? We're up against nation state foreign intelligence services ultimately. Not in all realms. I mean, like Ed points out, right? We give a lot of information away. But when it is, nefarious, it is a counterintelligence operation of which cyber has characteristically been the easiest attack surface, right? So, they could, sit on the other side of the globe with a keyboard and do grave harm. However, it really is part of what in counterintelligence we call a blended operation. And that is the adversary moves in and out of various in and out of these various areas as a function of time, opportunity, difficulty in penetrating the target. And those 4 areas roughly are human domain, that is an insider, a witting or unwitting, the cyber IT, cyber OT or operational systems, and then I'll put in quotes the supply chain, and that can be products, it can be hardware, it can be software, it can be drugs, it can be services. So the example I like to use there is, this is beyond cyber. Cyber is the big elephant, no question. But if we were to be able to somehow wave a magic wand and build the wall, like Mark says, and we're 100% cyber secure, does anybody believe their adversaries are just going to say, oh well, we'll give up? No, they'll come in through these other attack vectors. And that's really what our work has been about, magnifying those other effects. The example I like to use is, Stuxnet in Iran. Right. So if you're sitting and you're watching your IT network, you kind of miss the whole operation, because at least in the open source, that attack was perpetrated by an individual, a human, witting or unwitting, could have been a contractor, could have been a service technician, could have been an employee, carrying a thumb drive in and infecting a programmable logic controller in an OT system. So that particular attack completely bypassed coming in through a cyber realm, and at least a cyber IT and enterprise attack. So yes, there's no question that it is an actual war. I call it kind of the quiet war. It's a silent war. And they've had 20 years, our nation state adversaries, since 89, 90s, when they set off on this path. Those 3 eras that I talk about on that slide, the Pentagon would call that the first offset, the conventional era, the second offset. And we were saying for a long time, the third offset is technology. We're going to out-innovate and we're going to out-fight. As Ed's saying, we can't out-innovate them if they've got all the data. We can't out-innovate them if they've stolen our leading technology. And most of that is happening in the private sector. I sat in a pretty high-level government meeting, and the government was, had CEOs from all these companies, and the government was, demanding that we're going to protect our R&D, and they're, very respectfully, sir, the R&D that they're stealing, that you're using today, started in our labs 15 years ago, and it gets stolen there. So we have to protect our own R&D. By the time the government's using it, people just see the utility of it. So yes, it's absolutely a war. And I think with COVID, people have become more aware of it. I just heard about a poll that was coming out today, and I haven't had a chance to look it up. So you can't quote me on the numbers, but the number of it's a Rasmussen poll, the number of Americans who believe China is an adversary now has more than doubled in the last 2 years. And some of that's COVID, some not, but we've all become aware of, wow, supply chains matter. I can't necessarily get the drugs I need when they're threatening that they may just not ship them anymore. So it's not too late, but it is a war, and we have to kind of get on that footing.
Thanks, Chris. Very quickly, less than a minute, please describe that Cold War is a misnomer, and talk about the weaponization of applications, technology, hardware, software, networks TCL TVs that came out this week, Huawei, ZTE, Lenovo, Zoom. Talk about weaponization and how that fits into this hybrid warfare piece. Less than a minute, because we've got other folks that we need to talk to.
Yep, real quick. You know, so you say, well, why do they do that disruption? Why would they take these actions? You know, the three primary reasons is to steal IP, to make the system or enterprise not do what it's supposed to do when it's supposed to do it, or to collect intelligence. It is an intelligent, you know, it is, again, a nation state intelligence service executing that. So when they're turning on your camera or turning on a microphone and listening to you, that or tapping your 5G phone, that's part of that intelligence collection apparatus.
Outstanding, thank you. So Kristen, do you think our customers in the private sector and in the government, do they really understand the threat that's out there from our adversaries? Namely, the elephant in the room is, or actually the gorilla in the room is the Chinese Communist Party. But of course, Russia, the FSB with Russia's behind it, Iran, North Korea, and a list of others as well. Do you think the customers that you talk to in both the private sector and the public sector understand the true depth of the threat and the risk?
I'm back. Sorry about that.
There you go.
One thing, you know, in answer to the question, I think it's important not just to ask ourselves, do we understand it? I think we have to ask ourselves, do our allies understand it? And are allies willing to work with us? And I just wanted to point out, there is a statistic. We just did a study of consumer perception of privacy, consumer perception of trust of government. It was a worldwide study. And what we found is that in the US, I would agree that the perception of China and Russia from a US perspective has decreased. Unfortunately, if you look outside of the United States, only 20% of those that we surveyed would trust the US. So almost 70% trust China. So right, wrong, or indifferent, China is winning the battle from a cybersecurity perspective and is increasing its alliances with our traditional allies not to our benefit. And let's just make sure that we all understand that. Now, in answer to the questions is, do US corporations understand the risk? The answer is no, they clearly don't. One of the reasons why they don't, I think, is a very practical reason, is, you know, when you look at, and it goes back to incidents, when we've asked organizations, you know, how many of your material or significant, this is public companies we ask, material or significant incidents, and these are incidents would have to be reported on an SEC 8K, only 20% of them ever disclose. Why? Is because they're under legal privilege, they never get to a point where they actually have to disclose. Because there's a lot of questions about, was it a view of data? Was it a manipulation of data? Oh, by the way, ransomware events aren't often disclosable events. So therefore, in absence of information about what's really happening, and outside of pockets of industry like financial services, where the ISACs are working really well, a lot of large corporations, they simply don't see the risk. They don't feel it until it happens. And so for them, cybersecurity is still a compliance-oriented or crisis-oriented buying occasion. They're not necessarily thinking about it as a significant issue. Also, you know, the definition of critical infrastructure, let's go back to, you know, sort of the point on healthcare data. You know, Ancestry.com, would you consider that to be critical infrastructure? Now, under the CFIUS rules, now we have to begin to rethink this. But because of the way the CFIUS rules have been written, there's still questions we're getting from the, you know, MyHeritage and the, you know, the Church of the Latter-day Saints asking us, are we critical infrastructure? I don't even know how to define it. So there's still a semantics issue. So I think that, you know, are people waking up to the fact that, you know, there's a trust issue? Yes. Does it mean they know what to do about it? No. Does it mean they're acting on it? No. So I think that there's definitely an opportunity for us here.
Outstanding. Great summary on that piece of it. And along the lines of the allies, Mark, over to you. how do we build a more effective cyber response and really asymmetric warfare response with our allies and partners?
Thanks, Casey. And I want to pick up on Chris's great answer. I would also say that not knowing, a lot of things are critical infrastructure now. One of the things the government has to do is explain what are critical functions. What are those things that have to be, I think the DHS now call them national critical functions, but what are those things that the government has to take an active role in protecting and ensuring a resilient and redundant during an attack, cyber attack, or some other cataclysm. So we're doing that. I think the CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency at the DHS is attempting to get their hands around that. We've written some legislation to help them succeed in getting their hands around it. Onto the issue of the allies, I'd say, I'll make it quick. I'll say the first thing is we have to have a shared ability to detect. And what that means is we don't have to detect together. We have to have rule sets for sharing the information, ensuring we have a shared situational awareness as part of it. So that's more than the information, it's the understanding of the information, the assessment of the analytical assessment of the information. So that's step one, and that's got to be instantaneous. That can't be an Outlook email. It has to be speed of incident. The second thing we have to do is have a shared understanding of attribution. In other words, what level of attribution is required to believe an adversary was X doing malicious activity Y. So you got it. That takes time. It takes rule sets. It takes understanding. It takes exercises. It takes real world cooperation. So you detect, you attribute, and then you have to have a shared understanding of how you're going to respond to that. And then whoever has the tool and the appropriate legal authority to respond responds. But then you would share with each other the ability to move through battle space, so to speak, through cyberspace and each other's infrastructure to go back against that attack. Because often an attack's one of its jumping points could easily be through an ally or partner. So that I didn't describe every ally and partner there. I described kind of a coalition of the willing and the willing to work together on detection, attribution, and response. And that begins to shave down your, it keeps your Five Eyes, some of your Asian countries like Japan and Korea, and potentially, a few other European partners, from NATO and even outside NATO, who may agree to that kind of detect, attribute, and act kind of rubric. And so I think that's where we're headed on this. I do think there's a whole other part of international engagement that's inclusive and trying to work in organizations like the UN to make sure the Russians don't determine, what's the proper treaty for cybercrime, which is, that's a definite fox in the hen house situation. But, bottom line is that working with that coalition of the willing is what's going to get us there.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Ed, over to you for the final question. What can we do today to better protect individuals' health data? And again, to the audience, please don't think that this doesn't, it applies to you from a health data standpoint, but it also applies in every industry. So it's not just to healthcare. But Ed, again, what can we do today to better protect individuals' health data?
Right. So it was already mentioned that first we have to understand that there are these vulnerabilities that exist, right? To kind of put a very simple example is that if you're as an individual, if you're a victim of identity theft, it's very easy to change your credit cards, change your PIN codes. Possibly the financial institution can try to make you whole again. But when it comes to your health data, right, it comes up as something as intimate, as personal as your genetic sequence. Once that's gone, it's gone. There's no getting it back. There's no recourse, right? And there's no ability to tease it back out and to recoup any kind of loss. So there's a disconnect between privacy and national security. And I think that's what's contributed to some of our vulnerabilities. So it's how do you raise that level of awareness? I'd love to put it precisely that we just don't get it. And that's a problem. We're sort of in this vicious catch-22 that I provided this kind of awareness about the value of our health data. People get it, especially I've seen, CISOs for companies even get it too. But then when they bring it to the executive board or the C-suite, they don't get any play because they don't see the return on investment. Because in the short term, on top of which there's no U.S. government policy requiring them to do more, right? There's no requirement to provide individual consumer education, right? As to, if now you're going to start storing your electronic health records on here, you may want to be careful of what apps you download that help track your fitness. And if you're going to allow it permissions to access your health records that you've got on your phone now, if we're not at the base level providing that training and education, then we're just opening ourselves up to this vulnerability. And the other issue too is that we just haven't been given that smoking gun, although I like using the biospace race analogy, because nowhere else do we see this as a whole of government, whole of private sector, whole of academia, whole of society challenge. And we just haven't been conveying it in that way. And it's also important to note that it's not just about keep away. It's not about building walls, both physical and virtual, but it's also looking at the infrastructure, the data that we already have at our disposal. What investments are we making so we just run faster? It's not just about playing defense all the time. One of the ways we win this asymmetrical issue is how do we just out innovate and continue to out innovate, grow that lead, because it's conveying to the individual that the reason why you want to pay that extra little amount, the reason why you may want to ask your doctor, hey, where's my test going to be going, and causing some consternation there, but asking those second order questions and paying that a little more because of that ensuring that security and privacy. The reason being is that the long-term impact is that it's to our benefit at an individual level and also at a national level. And the last thing we want to do is find out that, hey, we just come in second place in a two-man race. And from a strategic standpoint, that's not where we want to be.
Outstanding. Ed, thank you very much. Again, that applies to all industries, specifically to healthcare, but outside of healthcare to every industry. I'd like to summarize by saying a couple of things. Unrestricted warfare basically means that our adversaries follow no rules whatsoever. So the United States, we've always heard, is a nation of laws. Our adversaries use those laws against us to keep our hands handcuffed and so on. That's one critical piece there. The summary that I hope that we've come full circle, we've given our audience a 360-degree view with this top panel of experts who are experts in their own right and the tip of the spear in each one of their functional areas that they focus on. So again, the success and survival of each company and our country, our government, requires the unification of risk, strategy, and the human factor. And we've covered that in this breakout today. So it's been my honor and my privilege to work with this team, and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much. I mean, I was riveted, so we could have kept going. I was actually putting it into the item to Casey. We can go for another 5 minutes or 10 minutes if we like. That was amazing, and that's also already just given me the idea to do another program around cyber warfare. So you all know I'm going to come back to you for another round, another session. Any like last comments for this group? Any additional remarks, Casey, since you're leading the conversation?
I think the panel has done a fantastic job. I've got nothing. The only other thing I'd add is to your audience. If you listen to this, you will be the most interesting person at Thanksgiving dinner and in the company in the coming weeks. So you'll be the most interesting person if you paid attention to this panel. That's the only other thing. I'm half serious about that, but that's all I have to add. This has been an excellent panel.
Well, I'll invite every one of you to Christmas or Thanksgiving dinner to me, so we'll have a good conversation. Besides football and politics.
Any other comments from the panel?
So much.
Final comments?
Yeah, final
yes, sir,
comment.
Mark.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
We're
folks.
grateful. So we know all you speakers, and we're hoping for more programming with you. So look out for an email from me in the coming weeks.
All right.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Good.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Well, a great panel. That was fantastic. Let me do another polling question just for CLE CPE purposes. So I want to know, in your opinion, which was the best session this afternoon? So is it the legal framework with Jeff Xiao, technology Fireside Chat with Ed, Tim, and Christina, the cyber insurance from Melissa, Monique, or the cyber warfare that we just finished up? All right, I'll give another 10 seconds and then I'll close this poll, show the results. All right, closing the poll. Looks like we got the cyber warfare. Definitely a good one. Excellent. I'm glad someone learned about a little bit about everything today. If you had more questions from our the audience has more questions to excuse me, for any of our panelists, let me know. Todd@fedpubseminars.com. I'll be happy to forward those questions along or give you the information to contact our experts there, so you can contact them going forward. Elizabeth, do you have any other closing statements or anything we want to talk about?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks again to FedPubs and to our sponsors. This is the 4th year that we've done this together, and I just feel like the topics are just progressing, and it's getting, I mean, I'm learning so much year over year. It's amazing. So I feel like the caliber of speakers is incredible. The topics are great, and I learned an awful lot. So we're grateful, we're appreciative to be involved in this and to co-chair that, and looking forward to another program next year. Hopefully in person, but we'll see how we're going to do that, as you alluded to earlier on.
Yep, and then we can also get, if you didn't get a chance to download any of the handouts that were available, I can certainly get those sent to you. Just go to info@fedpubseminars.com and request them, and we can get them to you shortly. So
this was also recorded, correct,
yes,
Todd? So
correct.
People can play.
It'll be available in about a week on our website, so we're happy to have that available. Probably a week and a half, with Thanksgiving around the corner. Probably right after that, matter of fact. So as soon as we get it rendered, we'll have it out on our website. So look for it there as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Elizabeth, for helping host. And we are looking forward to maybe another session of this. And when I close out, there will be a quick survey on this. I'd love to know if this was worth your time and valuable, and if it's something we want to do in the spring or maybe a couple times a year, and do it as a virtual or in-person or hybrid type thing. So that would be excellent if you could give us that feedback in the survey. With that, thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon, or what's left of it.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.